this is another thing that was discovered, that the immune system, okay, it's receiving information from other systems, but it also can send information to the brain via, it can make its own peptides. This is what, again, was a sort of revelation to scientists, that the immune system can make its own peptides or molecules to send around. So they found that the immune system is directly communicating with the endocrine system. For example, they found that it has its effects right on the immune, on the endocrine system itself, without, again, having going to the brain. Sometimes they talk about this as crosstalk. In a simplified way, you can think of it as cross-talking between the two systems without all the organs in the brain being involved. Okay. There's a lot of history behind that, which I don't have time to share, about how these things were discovered. I love to look at that sort of aspect of it as well, but it's quite interesting to see how these things were discovered. In fact, just reminds me to go back and say, when we were talking about type 2 diabetes, about 100 years ago, they discovered that people with diabetes, their diabetes improved if they had aspirin. And so they realized at the time that the aspirin was having an anti-inflammatory effect. But it was never sort of explored further, this fact that if you can lower the inflammation, it might have an effect on the diabetes in some people. So it's only like 100 years later that we're able to understand the mechanism of how those salicylates in the aspirin were working. Okay, so now we're going to look at the immune system and the nervous system a bit. In 1981, a guy named David Felton discovered that network of nerves lead to blood vessels and to cells of the immune system, and they terminate in clusters of the mast cells. And then he found that branches of the vagus nerve also infiltrated the thymus gland. Now this is information that we probably couldn't have known before that time, because we didn't have the equipment to allow us to investigate it at that level of detail. But it was still pretty revolutionary. And it just shows how the immune system is able to talk to the cells that it interacts with directly. And then another scientist, Blaylock, found that leukocytes can themselves make hormones and neuropeptides, the same ones that the brain is secreting. Those same neuropeptides can be made by leukocytes. So these are cells of the immune system can actually make peptides themselves. So it doesn't always have to be coming from the brain. So again, he concluded that the immune system is talking with every other body system, and he called it a sensory organ for internal homeostasis, which is again going back to that idea of the stress response and bringing the body back to homeostasis as a sort of baseline level of operation. Okay, the next one, please. And this is another very fascinating bit of work. These are psychologists, actually. They're not physiologists or medical scientists in that sense. But they were researching and doing investigations following Pavlov. You remember Pavlov, the Russian investigator of early in the 20th century, or even earlier perhaps, about dogs and how they salivate and things like that. But they discovered that if we learn something mentally well enough, and I suppose deeply enough, we can use that to alter our physiology. Now, this is not very happy kind of research if you're an animal rights person. But what they did was in this particular experiment that we're talking about, they would give a drug to a mouse, and they also gave them at the same time. It was an immune-suppressing drug. It suppressed the immune system. And at the same time, they gave saccharin. And they did this repeatedly over a set period of time. And then gradually they withdrew the drug, but they kept giving him the saccharin. And so after a while, the same effects would happen to the mouse's body with the saccharin without any drug being in his system at all. So that was an example of how you can learn the body learns in a big way, it's a big kind of learning with quotes, to associate a certain taste. We're talking about physical taste. That's an information that's going into our body, a very, sweet taste, very powerful taste. And it alters the body's physiology and the way the cells are behaving. So much that it can suppress your immune system. I mean, that's a pretty big idea. And I guess part of this feeds into the whole idea of helping to try and be more positive in as much as we can. But the other thing that following that was that one woman had a lady had a daughter who had a very bad immune condition. She had to take quite heavy drugs for it. She knew that they would have very, very bad side effects down the line. So she contacted them, and they worked out a program to try and lower the dose of the drugs she needed to try and using this information. And so they worked out a program where she would, whenever she took her drugs, I think she had lupus, she would she would smell rose oil, and I think she also took some castor oil. I never could figure that one out. But anyway, she took those things and for a set period of months, and she was taking her drugs at the same time. And then again, gradually, they started to lower the drug dose to see if it would still maintain the level of suppression of her lupus that she needed. And it worked. Effectively, that worked. She was able to lower the dose of the drugs she had to take by this conditioning. So it's possible. It takes a huge amount of work, but it is possible. And it's possible that we can recondition ourselves through other positive experiences that kind of override those maybe traumatic early learning experiences that may be setting us up for constant stress. I mean, that's the principle behind it, really. And then historically, the other thing to mention is that these are the actual people, these two people coined the term psychoneuroimmunology. They're the ones that did that, and they wrote a book about it, the first book about it, trying to bring together this whole idea of psychology affecting neurology and affecting immunology at the same time, and all those things being constantly talking to each other in the body and having the effects that they do. Okay, then moving on to another aspect of it. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of the relaxation response. This was, I can remember this from the 60s and 70s. It was quite big news then. It was probably the first time that the medical profession actually started looking at anything other than drugs or in a long time anyway, on a big scale. But anyway, he was the one who sort of discovered that we have alpha waves, that we can produce alpha waves if we get into a deep state of meditation, and they are associated with calmness and quietness and that sort of thing. And he was able to train people to do that, and he had a whole program called the relaxation response. It's still going, but I like to give him credit because we've all forgotten that sort of. He was one of the pioneers of that aspect of it. I think he might have been the one that went out to Nepal and sort of put electrodes on, Nepalese Buddhist monks and tested them to see what was happening when they had their meditations. Okay, thank you. Okay. Then there was another person called Howard Hall, and he was the one who discovered that if you use self-hypnosis, imagery, guided imagery, and autogenics or biofeedback, you can actually make the stickiness of your white blood cells increase. And that's, again, a mental thing, have an effect on a very physical body, tissue system on the cells. So again, that's quite mind-body connection, important work. So with these discoveries, we found that the autonomic nervous system is actually not beyond our conscious control. So these are some of the people that helped us come to that realization, and I think their work has fed into cognitive behavioral therapy and mindfulness training. It helps knowing this background that these people have done. It can make it more acceptable that scientists and medical doctors can now recommend these sort of techniques to people to help them deal with some of their conditions. Okay. I'm aware that we have a break in a few minutes, I think. So we've seen that there's a relationship between the nervous system and the immune system and inflammation. If we just take a small break now to talk about the vagus nerve, this is something I just found out about maybe a year ago. I think I listen to some of the health programs on the radio sometimes, and I listened to this, and I found out about the vagus nerve. And what they're doing now is this is work being done in Holland, and then separately some people are doing some work in North Carolina. The vagus nerve is, it's the nerve that comes out of the body. I think it's the 10th nerve, and cranial nerve, and there are reflexes for the vagus nerve, we know, and so it basically innervates the visceral organs, so the heart, the kidneys, the lungs, the intestines. All of that is being informed and controlled and energized with nerve energy by the vagus nerve. Vagus actually comes from a Latin word meaning wandering. That's because it kind of wanders. It splits into two, and it wanders into all these aspects of the visceral system, visceral area, I think. But what they're finding is that if the vagal tone is low, it is associated with inflammation. So in one of these people in the Netherlands have made implanted an electrode somehow into the vagal nerve here, and that if it can increase the vagal tone, then that influences the spleen to produce fewer inflammatory agents. So they're using that with rheumatoid arthritis patients, and they're getting pretty good results. So again, this is something that I think we could take heart from as reflexologists and focus on the vagus nerve sometimes for other things besides just digestion. It really has a big part to play with that, and also our heart rate, which we'll come on to again in a minute. And what these ladies or researchers in North Carolina are doing is they have realized that it has a huge amount of influence on our moods as well, and vice versa, that our moods can affect the tone of the vagus nerve. And they've done experiments where they've encouraged people to do what they call loving kindness meditation. It's a meditation technique that is easy for the average person to pick up, and they've set up this experiment where they I'm a bit rusty on the details of it, but they basically got them to do this meditation technique, and then they would measure their vagus nerve tone and also their mood and other things like that, and they found that it really improved. So I think this the references for these pieces of work are at the end of your notes, so you should be able to look that up. But it's a significant piece of research, I think. Let me just read through it and see if there's anything I need to add before I go on. Yeah, it was their idea was that you could self-generate these positive emotions or a positive mood, put it like that, through this meditation technique, and then that would have an effect on the vagus nerve. So it's the idea that this is available to anybody, can be trained to do this through this, and they just use that one technique. They have to use something, so that's the one they chose. But obviously other things, maybe explaining why other forms of meditation are having the effects that they do. One of the knock-on effects. Okay, thank you. We'll just move on. What I usually do at this time is talk about the lymphatic system and the craniosacral system, but we're not going to be able to do that today. So we're going to move on to the connective tissue system in a minute, but I think we're going to have a break now. Okay, so thank you. Are there any questions? Oh, good.
What's the vagal tone?
Well,
sorry. Okay. What's the vagal tone?
Right, the vagal tone, I think, is when the nerve is not functioning at its optimum best. It's like a muscle tone. Muscles can be out of tone. They're not functioning like they should. They don't have the integrity of their tissues, for example, or maybe because of the inflammatory aspect affecting them, or some other thing is affecting the tone of that nerve, so it can't perform its function as it should be.
Okay, and that's measurable.
And that's measurable,
scientifically.
apparently.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Going to think about and talk about the connective tissue network now. As I say, these other systems are also operating, and along with the other ones that we've already mentioned earlier today. But we're just going to shift our focus now to the connective tissue aspects of the body. Okay, if we can move on, please. Now, this work, I'm a very derivative person. So I'm taking this from a book called Energy Medicine by James Oshman. Energy Medicine by James Oshman. Again, not a new book. I think it was written in the 90s. He is a physicist, but he wrote this, I thought, was a really great book about electrical and physical, in the sense of physics, aspect of the body and how it works. And again, he's another author who is a scientist but made connections with the complementary medicine world. He's got a chapter in there about acupuncture and homeopathy as well, about how they can be seen to be working in terms of some of the concepts that he talks about in the book, which is mainly electromagnetic energy. So he says that you can view the body as an electromagnetic energy field, which, I mean, you know, I've known this. When I used to teach reflexology, I always said that we always have electromagnetic energy, and when you do your hands like that and you get some of that sort of static electricity energy going, that's what you're tuning into. And also when you work on somebody, our bioelectric energy is a kind of part of what's going on when we treat them. So that was something that I had thought about, but you know, having read this book, it just gave you so much more detail about how that can be happening. And also being in tune with the bigger macro environment of the world, not only the Earth, but the energy around the Earth, the electromagnetic energy, it's all affecting us all the time. We're not usually aware of it. We know that the tides can affect us in terms of having which again we forget mostly, but the water, the moon, all those sort of things are actually, and the seasons, and you know, as much as our food, we're not so aware of them, but they're all affecting us. And one of the things he talked about is that these electromagnetic fields have a pulsation. So the idea of a pulse, of oscillation, of alternation, which is attuned to the idea of rhythm, is very important. So they have their own pulsations or rhythm. And that you can look at the connective tissue as a structure, in terms of it's got a structure, and it's got an energy, this bioelectrical magnetic energy, and it's a tissue that has a ability to communicate with the rest of the body. And it's got sort of, because of this, and because it's body-wide, to use Candace Pert's term, it's got an internal coherence that affects all of the body. And he makes the point that, you know, we've talked about these peptides flowing and being released into the blood and circulating, and then you get down to his perspective is what's happening as those peptides approach the cell. Well, they have to go through the interstitial fluid. Once they come out of the capillary, they go into the interstitial fluid, and then they come up close to the cell, right? So that's where the connective tissue is, that interstitial tissue. That's a form of connective tissue. We have different forms of it in our bodies. Even bone, the hardest, the most dense, is a form of connective tissue. So you'll have to go back to your anatomy and physiology books a bit to read up about some of this. But so in a way, those molecules have to flow through that fluid of the, it's a kind of fluid at that level to get to the molecules. So it's affecting how those molecules behave as well. So it's another system to bear in mind when we think about that. And he makes the point that it's dynamic. That means it's always changing and responding to conditions that it finds itself in, and it's very rhythmic. Okay, thank you. He also explains how even our emotional states can correlate with the electrical energy in the body. I guess this is a way, again, going back to the previous work about the alpha waves. That's a form of electromagnetic energy that the brain is emitting. And or electrical energy that the brain is emitting, and again, that is known to associate with our moods. And he also explains how even our physiological rhythms are associated with healing states of peace and love and appreciation. So having a sense of well-being, having a sense of connection with our environment, with our people that we love and loved ones around us, and actually that can affect the rhythms of our body. That's the heart rate, the rhythm of food going through our digestion, that whole system of taking food in and letting out the waste products and that food being taken up. That's another kind of rhythmic system, and it's all being affected by that. So he says that these, the matrix, which is what he calls the connective tissue system, it's a living matrix. That's a very interesting word, because if you look at the root of it, it goes back to the word for the womb and for the mother. And it's used in other spheres. It's used in mathematics, has a slightly different meaning there. It's used in other kind of scientific disciplines to mean slightly different things. But one of its meaning is to be the source, as in a womb, from which things come. But also the idea that it's the support, or the support for that coming into being. So it's the idea of the connective tissue being a matrix, a kind of a net that's holding everything together behind the scenes, as it were. Other things are embedded or enmeshed in that, like our bones, our organs, and that sort of thing. So it's that kind of idea of a net, or a web, I guess, is a better idea even than that. And it's all, because it's all, even though we have different forms of connective tissue, because they are basically from the same kind of tissue in their origin, from where they come as when we're from the embryo, they're all also connected. So they're all kind of sensitive to each other, all these different forms of connective tissue. So the matrix has aspects that are gravitational. We spoke about being influenced by gravity, mechanical, electrical, magnetic, thermal, acoustic, and phototonic. So I'm just focusing today on the aspect of mechanical and these two a bit, but thermal, that has to do with heat and obviously sound and light. So it probably plays into the sensation of light that we get and how that affects us as well. And then he talks about how different therapeutic approaches can focus on one or other of these other phenomena, and that each of these approaches can affect the entire system, and that would include reflexology. He's not talking about that in his book, but it would include things like reflexology. Okay, next one, please. So again, I would like to just focus on the word network. So we've talked about networks before, and the idea of everything being connected. And I like the idea that connective tissue gives you the clue to how important it is, because it's connecting up other things. Everything else in the body is actually kind of embedded in this web of connective tissue. It's very intimately associated with all the other cells and tissues of the body, the lungs, the intestines, the nerves, the immune system, the bones. Some of it is what surrounds and supports and lubricates. In fact, what it does is we have, around the muscles anyway, we have muscle groups, and they talk about muscle planes, and the connective tissue allows those to glide across each other so that when we're using our muscles, there's less friction. So it's very important for our muscular system. And so similarly to the neuropeptide effect, it's functioning as a body-wide mechanical sensitive. In other words, it's sensitive to mechanical pressure. That's what that term means. It's sensitive to mechanical pressure, and when it does receive those pressures or that stimulation, it sends a signal to the entire network. So does that ring a bell with anybody? This is what we're doing when we apply our pressure with reflexology. We're actually applying pressure to this connective tissue system, and it's having its ongoing effects through the connective tissue. And this is something that, I never even thought about when I was really learning or even practicing reflexology for years. So I thought it was pretty important to bring that out. So yeah, I've just said that basically. Okay, next slide, please. Now, one thing about the connective tissue is it can be altered by pathological conditions. It's like, if you get, for example, at the moment, my husband has a bad knee, and he has pain in his knee when he bends it, so he's walking about a bit like this. And that's changing his whole posture, and he's getting pain every time he steps, so he's getting pain signals being set off and things like that. So it's actually, in a way, remodeling his musculature and his posture in response to that. So it's that in itself is having an effect on the signaling system, because if he's too tense in one place, then that means that the blood can't flow there so well, the lymphatic fluids are not flowing in that place so well, the nerve energy is not going in that place so well, so it's affecting the signaling system, even of the connective tissue as well, because it's going to be stressed by all that tension, that restriction of blood, etc., etc. So it all kind of goes round and round and feeds itself, doesn't it? So the connective tissue can also be affected by changes in movement. So from the bad, you can also improve that. I don't know if any of you watched that program about the doctor who gave up drugs or something. It was on recently. But one of the subjects in one of his little features was a lady who had very bad chronic pain. She'd had it for about 3 years. She could hardly move, etc., etc. But he took her to after speaking with her and building up to it, but he took her to a Tai Chi expert. Qigong. And he got her one-to-one lessons with this Qigong master. And then they went back weeks later to see what she was like. And, she was actually able to move in a more or less normal way. She had already made huge, and that was just because she'd been through this positive change in movement with some repetition enough so that she actually released all that tension that she had, and she was in huge amounts less pain. So that's just one example of how that can work. Oh, and I wanted to bring in the idea of pandiculation. Have any of you ever heard of that? That was something I found out from Peter McCarrath from the Christie Hospital in Manchester. He didn't do the work, but he highlighted this aspect that it's when we stretch. Like when we get up in the morning, we stretch. Yawn, like that. And when dogs stretch, and they put their hands 4 feet down and they stretch like that. Whenever they studied animals, and they noticed that mammals like dogs, whenever they have been lying down, when they get up, they do a little bit of a stretch, or they might waggle or something like that to sort of rearrange their bodies. And they've studied that, and it's a bit of a hypothesis, but they're pretty sure that when that happens, it's resetting all the connective tissue and muscles in the body. And it can actually help with any conditions when the body's in a restricted state, when the myofascia of the body or the fascial tissue, the connective tissue or muscles are tense. So it's an intuitive thing that people and animals do. And so the idea of pandiculation, he gives people a little stretchy man to encourage them to stretch. It's a little thing about that high, and it can stretch, made out of rubber. And so he gives it to people and he says, now you do this and you stretch and you go like that. And he just, and they use it in the Christie for people with compromised lungs and they're not breathing very well, and they have their stretchy man and they go, just that little tiny bit of stretch where they maybe can't hardly do that. It's actually stretching their intercostal muscles, and it actually improves their breathing over time. If you do it enough, it makes a big difference. So again, this idea of stretching being important. And it's also affected by the connective tissue signaling by touch and palpation and compression, which is, again, what we're doing with reflexology. And then he also talks about how it influences the other body-wide systems. It's a bit like in lymphatic drainage. You learn how it's a bit like a pebble being thrown into the water, and then you get the reverberating rings of waves that go out into the pond. It's a bit like that. You press at any point, and it has that reverberating effect through the system, but it's very subtle. It's hard to measure it unless you have the right kind of things. So similarly to the neuropeptide system, it's functioning as a whole body communication system. Some of this work we're going to talk about in a bit more detail in a moment. A couple of other things about connective tissue is it's the largest single tissue in the body, if you think about that. I mean, we used to say the skin is the largest organ. This is even larger, if you think about that. It goes from the skull, it's in the dura mater of the skull, and it goes down the spinal cord. So it's in that part of our body as well. It's very intimate with that. It has different fascial planes. The fascia is a particular type of loose connective tissue. So it's providing the pathways for nerves to go into structures and for the blood vessels to go in for structures. So we were talking about the coronary artery, for example. Well, we know that has smooth muscle in it. All the muscles in the body have connective tissue wrapping around them or along them. So that's where connective tissue is, right there in that coronary artery as well. And it has a nutritional function, so it allows the nutrition to get into the cells and the waste products to be released. And 1/4 of all our body fluids are housed in the connective tissue, 1/4. That's a big number, big amount. It also contains its own mast cells, so immune cells, macrophages, and that white blood cells are also contained in the connective tissue. And this is also what people that do myofascial release and trigger point work, when you're doing body work, they're actually contacting that connective tissue to help release that cause of that pain. So it's a pretty important system. Thank you. So this is just an image. I think you can see this one all right, but it shows the connective tissue coming from the bone. So it's wrapping around the bone, and then it's got the muscles coming out from that. So it goes around the muscle fascicle or bundle, and then within that muscle you've got blood vessels as well. So it's in between all these things inside. These are the individual muscle bundles within this muscle, and these black dots are blood vessels. And then each of these muscles it becomes individual muscle fiber. And also the connective tissue is around that, and it's between the individual muscles, and right down here to the individual ones. So you can see how it's part and parcel at a very deep level of every muscle tissue. And what it's not showing is that the nerves are going through all this connective tissue as well to innervate the muscle, as well as the blood vessels being shown. Okay. This is another piece of information I got from the work of a man named Tom Myers. That reminds me to suggest, I can't show a lot of images here because they're that you can find, but if you go on the web and just put in fascia or connective tissue, you'll see some amazing pictures of what it looks like. And some of the people that are working with it one of the people is Tom Myers. He works with fascial release, myofascial release it's sometimes called, and he's identified that this is superficial, an example of a superficial line of connective tissue that goes from the bottom of the foot around the heel and up the back of the legs and all the way up to the top of the head, a superficial level of connective tissue. So that means that, in reflexology, when we're accessing the feet, we're actually affecting that connective tissue line. We're actually helping to send signals up that line. So I think that's how that kind of work of his can feed into reflexology. And then there's another, that's just one line. There's another one in the front of the body, and then there are other ones that kind of go in different directions. But if you look up anatomy trains on the web, you'll see quite a lot of pictures and some introductory information about that, which is very helpful for explaining the system. Okay. Now this is another piece of research I came across just by accident, I think. I don't know if it might have been one of the things I heard on the radio, but I might have just come across it. But anyway, it's really mind-blowing because this is a doctor researcher in Vermont. Her name is Helen Langevin, and her colleagues who have been studying how acupuncture might be working. And what they did was they managed to show that what happens when an acupuncture needle is inserted into the body and given twists, which is how they do it. Have any of you ever had acupuncture? So they spin the needle, or they rotate it about, in this case they were measuring it up to 7 times of rotation. So you put the needle in, then and they've captured this image of the needle going in, and I hope it comes out clearly, but anyway, the paper's available on the web if you want to look at it. And you've got the details in your references at the end. If you can see gradually, what this is gradually this is connective tissue. And every time it gets turned, it's picking up more connective tissue. So that by this time, it's an actual kind of whirl of connective tissue around the needle. And the idea of that is that the connective tissue is being stretched as it's being, that's a natural response of the tissue to that insertion of the needle, and the rotation of the needle. But what the effect of it is that the tissue is being stretched. And her explanation, or that her conclusion, is that is creating a signaling in the body that's telling the body to calm down or whatever. I mean, she's using that as a possible explanation for how acupuncture works, another explanation for how it might be working. But I just thought that was amazing to see that physically captured in these kind of specialized photographs, which you have to have super equipment to even do. But and there's also available on the web, she gives a lecture as well, which you can see. Anyway, somebody asked her at the end of the lecture, do you know about the work of Oshman? And so she said, yes, they've been communicating. I thought that was quite good as well. Okay, the next one, please. This is, again, from that piece of research. Now, I don't think this image is all that helpful to you, but this one, it just shows, she did research, she did a sort of investigation to show that acupuncture, a lot of acupuncture points, I don't know about all of them, I'm not an acupuncturist, but many of them are located at muscle plane where they come together. 2 different muscles come together, they call it a cleavage plane. And she did a thing too, she showed that this is a control point where a needle would be placed. It's on the connective tissue, but it's not at a place where 2 muscles come together. And then they measured the effect of those 2 needles, and they somehow found that it's where the acupuncture needle is placed that has the effect. I mean, that's very simplified, but I think that's the gist of that research. So it is important where they're placed, that they're in the connective tissue at this juncture. So again, this is connective tissue here, going all in and amongst the muscles. And it's where they all come together in one place that's where you get a particularly profound effect from a stimulation, put it like that. Okay? Thank you. Okay, so that just really thought that was pretty inspiring. When you think about we can do the same with reflexology, and we probably are doing that, especially if you hold a point and go around it, perhaps, when you're holding it dynamically and then just going around it. This is hypothetical, but I think it's a possibility that we're having those effects on the connective tissue. Now, this is going back again to Oshman's work. He actually had this amazing picture in his book where with electromagnetic field he created, there's a powerful magnet up here, very powerful magnet, and then it's just to show how human tissue responds to electromagnetic energy or fields. But it showed that enough electromagnetism can be generated, or enough of a magnet, that it affects the tissues of somebody's fingers, and they can suspend another magnet or piece of metal between their fingers, because this field is flowing through and augmenting our own magnetic properties that we have in our fingers. So again, they call it diamagnetism. Organic substances in human tissue can develop magnetic properties within a magnetic field, strongly enough to stabilize a magnet. So obviously when we're working, we're not having a magnetic field, but it just demonstrates that we have these properties in our tissues that when we come in contact with somebody else's magnetic field, potentially, not in every circumstance, but potentially can have an effect. Okay, the next one, please. So this is, the idea here is that he felt that practitioners can train themselves with this information to, and this is possibly is what's happening when people have a treatment and they get quite a profound effect. Maybe not necessarily at that moment, but later on. That this is because the practitioner has been able to generate this kind of stimulation of the connective tissue, which is then converted into electrical signals. And it's conducted through the system, and it's influencing not only the connective tissue, but individual cell behavior. Okay, next one, please. And then he's got a very interesting chapter about what he calls entrainment. Entrainment, I think it's a French word, but it means when the practitioner to me it means when you're in tune with your patient, when you become in tune with yourself, and then you can tune into your patient but there's actually a physical thing going on there with these magnetic impulses and the magnetic fields where you become synchronized, and that just enhances the effects of the treatment that you're giving. So he was talking about that quite a lot, which I thought was very important to bring out. And also he talks about how rhythm is inherent in the Earth's magnetism, and therefore we should remember that rhythm is important in our work. When we do reflexology, there's a certain rhythm, or not a certain rhythm, but aspects of rhythm come into it, and that's affecting the rhythm of the person who's receiving the reflexology is the idea. I want to go into this Schumann resonance. It's too technical and take too long. But he talks about it in the book. So this is just some of the quotes from Oshman and from Pert, which I thought were quite good about how we work and how the state of mind and relaxation that we're in, especially with our breath, again, we can self-generate peptides through our breathing. And again, it highlights the importance of us being in tune with ourselves as much as possible when we give treatments, and in a more or less relaxed state of mind when we're giving our treatments, as well as being alert. Relaxation doesn't mean you're like sleeping. It means that you're relaxed and alert. You're in a state of repose, but alert awareness. Okay, thank you. So just to summarize, we've looked at the basic idea about reflexology affecting blood and lymph flow. And it can improve the quality of the blood so that if the blood is not too viscous, which it tends to get as we age anyway, then obviously these informational substances are going to be able to be more efficient in their activities. And it can affect the lymphatic load as well. But now what we've sort of talked about today and we can bring into our awareness is that it's improving the flow of the informational substances and the cell-to-cell talk. And it's helping to balance the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis in a very profound way. Okay, next one, please. So these are, we're going to move into the practical aspect in a minute, but I just put these things up here, and for you on your handouts, I'm not going to talk about them. We're not going to do them, but it's just things for you to think about, which I'm sure you're already doing, but it's just to put them down for maybe looking at again and putting together with what you've learned today. Okay, thank you. Here's the next slide. Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to focus here about the idea of rhythm when we do the practical. So this slide is really to sort of get us ready for the practical demonstration. And I'm just going to brought this in to talk about rhythm and stretch, or what I also call traction. So we've looked at how the connective tissue responds to pressure and warmth and touch and palpation, which is what we're doing when we do reflexology. We're compressing tissue and we're releasing it, and that can all have an effect on the connective tissue and encouraging it to send signals. But I've also been inspired by research talking about how stretch affects the connective tissue. And there was a really interesting program. I was already doing this in my work, but then recently I saw a program about passive stretching. It was actually on that program about Trust Me, I'm a Doctor. And he had a feature about how can stretching be as good for you as exercise? And what he was bringing out was that scientists and researchers that especially research sports medicine and things like that. Especially one of them was at the University of Wolverhampton. So they've done this trial where they give people exercise to do, and then they also give passive stretching in a particular way, and then they measure the effects that has on all these measurements of the body heart rate and things like that. And they found that actually passive stretching is pretty much just as good as exercise. That's when somebody does it for you. Okay? So again, that's pretty, I think that has a thing to play into how we do our reflexology. So it reduces blood glucose levels, it increases heart rate, and it helps even burning calories, stretching. I mean, don't you think that's amazing? It decreases the, this is from another piece, not from Wolverhampton, but it's thought to, subdue the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, and it allows the parasympathetic nervous system to function better. And so again, that helps to feed into the relaxation effect and the encouragement of all the autonomic functions of the body that go on when we're relaxed to occur and be more efficient. So you're getting a lot of knock-on effects there as well. Okay, next one, please. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to do the demonstration. I'm going to demonstrate a kind of accentuation on stretching, and I'm going to demonstrate a technique which I call calcaneus talus rocking of the joint in the foot. And so these slides are just to sort of give the rationale behind that. I chose that because looking at the anatomy and physiology and everything, it just seemed like that was it's around where the sacroiliac reflex is. And so the idea when you do that is that you're helping to release the sacroiliac area, much as a massage therapist or a craniosacral therapist might do. So for some people with back problems, that would be a good, it's a good technique to use. And then this, again, it explains why I've chosen that. So, yeah, I think on the next slide, please. Okay, but before we do it, I thought we could look at some of the anatomy of all that. So this is the bones, just showing the bones. So this is the area around where we're talking about. And you'll notice that if you look at anatomy books, they hardly ever include the connective tissue, do they? I mean, I tried to find pictures of it just for this, and I couldn't find very many. They talk about it, but it's always in isolation, like around a muscle tissue or something like the one we used before. But anyway, this shows you the displacement of the bones. You've got the tibia coming down here. This is the talus bone, and this is the calcaneus bone, and this is the navicular bone. So right around in here is the area that we're going to be concentrating on. And it's good for you to go back and study on your own maybe how these bones articulate together and the different facets on the talus bone and the calcaneum where they interact. Because all around there's going to be connective tissue. There's periosteum, that's the connective tissue around bones. And then you're going to have the tendons and all the connective tissue around the tendons and the muscles of the foot as well. But this particular area is a sort of a, I know it's not an intersection, but it's where a lot of these tissues are coming together. So I think it also is a good place to focus on from that point of view. Okay, next slide, please. This is the back view of the calcaneum, so just to see how those bones are articulating with each other here, right here. Talus and the calcaneum. Okay, and this is the reflex the area of the body that area of the foot reflexes to, which is the sacroiliac area. Okay. And then this is just my own drawing of that. But I also found out about this area called the sustenaculum tali, which is, it arises out of the calcaneum, and it's like a ledge. That's what this word means, a kind of ledge. And some of the tendons and the ligaments of the foot come out from under that to go up towards the toe, and in other words, come in on top of it. So I think it's what you can feel on people's feet. We'll talk about it when we do the practical, but it's an area that sometimes you feel on some people's feet, other times you can't feel it so much because of the disposition of their tissues, but it's definitely kind of an area to watch. Okay, next slide, please. And then there's also these bands or cross bands of what they call retinaculum. So they're bands of connective tissue that go around an area to sort of stabilize it. So you have those around, especially knee joints, shoulder joints, and the ankle joint, because they're very important for our walking and posture and everything like that. So that's another layer of tissue that actually we're making contact with when we do reflexology. Okay, next one, please. So these are just some of the cautions to be aware of when you do this work, if you use these techniques. So especially on elderly or frail clients, where they're frail they can be of any age, but if they're frail, you want to be very careful about it. If they've had a history of arthritis in that area or in the knee or in the hip as well, just have to be aware of that. Any local diseases that they may have had in their history, and any obviously skin conditions that you may contraindicate it. And just if you're doing it, just start slowly and gently and kind of go from there, and sort of being aware of what's the response is as you go, and testing it out with the client to see how they're responding and that sort of thing. So just kind of be aware of those cautions. Okay, I think that's the last one of those. If you go to the next slide, it might give. Oh, it talks about rhythm now. Okay, well, I think we've talked about that enough, but I just think rhythm is very important, so that feeds into this technique I'm going to show you. Okay, next slide, please. And these are the instructions for the practical. So I think we can break there now, and we'll set up for the practical, because I think you've got this on your paper. Okay, thank you.